really appreciate you coming on the channel today. I know we've been talking for quite some time. Um, for those who might not know you and your work and your background, would you be willing to give us a little bit of your background and some of the things that you've worked on in the last few years, and some of the things that you're interested in
Oh yeah.
as it relates to the gospel of Jesus Christ and the things that we're going to talk about today?
Yeah, thanks, Jacob. I appreciate you having me on here. So I was born and raised in Israel, member of the church, married to a woman from Ukraine, so we're a pretty international family. And I've always had an interest in a lot of these things, but my big passion studying is Jewish traditions. I've gone fairly deep on those more than a lot of people I know. It's just that's something that I've got hundreds of books on, a lot of them in Hebrew, which isn't always accessible. And I guess this research, I've been thinking of doing something like this for about 15 years with the Book of Abraham. And it all kind of starts with some of the mosaics that we'll talk about. But the Sepphoris mosaic, that's actually something where I saw it when it was not yet open to the public. I was 7 or so, and we had gone as a family to volunteer at the archaeological dig in the early 90s on summer break. And so though that was really impressive back then and still is, and it's got some great possibilities for understanding the gospel deeper. And it just kind of went from there, the idea of stars and planets as not just astronomical bodies in the sky, but actually connected to divine beings that we explored in the paper. That's a really fascinating topic. And just, I do things as an independent researcher. And I figure if I can do it, anyone can. You just have to buckle down, learn how to think historically, how to use sources. And that's it. Let your imagination help you find connections and things that maybe others haven't noticed. And then some research projects. I mean, we're working with Spencer Krause, my co-author in this. We're working on Jasher commentary that's going to bring together almost all of the known research that's been done, and there's far less than you might think's actually been done in this book. But we're going to bring that to an LDS audience and help place it in its time and place, but still find value in it. So there's a lot that we're planning to do there. I've got some other projects. I've got something that I'm doing on Josiah's reforms from a different angle, which hopefully comes out a bit later this year.
Awesome. Um, so on the note of some of the work that you've done over the last few years or so, one paper that I particularly enjoyed was one you did with Neil Rapley on sort of validating Alma as as an authentic Semitic name, a male Semitic name,
Oh yeah.
in the Book of Mormon. Um, at some point, I would love to have you back on, and we can talk more about Semitic names, the Book of Mormon, and that paper more specifically. Um, but with regards to this paper that we're going to talk about today, it's called "My Name Is the Sun: uh, Patriarchs, Planets, and the Book of Abraham," and this is a fairly recent paper. Actually, I believe it's not uh, published officially yet, correct?
Yeah, so the paper itself should be published around November, December of this year.
Okay,
There should be a
awesome.
two volume book coming out through Interpreter and Eborn Books. I believe their website is already mentioning it. I don't think it's available pre-order yet, but it's getting there. So towards the end of the year, it should be coming out. The conference, though, with the recorded presentation, that's been up on Interpreter's website and YouTube since May.
Yeah, and I will include the link in the description of this video for anybody who wants to watch your presentation on this paper over on Interpreter Foundation's YouTube channel. I found it incredibly fascinating. The entire conference revolved around Abrahamic traditions, and the Book of Abraham. So we had a number of speakers to hear from in that presentation across 2 weekends. And so one of the most fascinating ones I found was the presentation that you did on this particular paper that you co-wrote with Spencer Krause. And I'm wondering, what was the catalyst for you and Spencer working together on this particular project?
I'm trying to remember exactly what it was. We've been collaborating on a few things. We were talking and oh yes, now I remember what it was. We both had an idea that we kind of wanted to do for the conference, and we both had these two ideas, and we thought, okay, let's co-author them. We can make sure they both get in there. So it, it it was something like that, practical reasons, but we work really well together as a team, figuring out these things. So it really made papers better that way.
So, being that you are from Israel, Hebrew is your
Native
primary
language.
native language, correct?
Yeah, so I grew up speaking Hebrew and English together at the same time.
So, uh, the reason I asked that, and I, I I have found that as I try to look up more information on various topics related to the Hebrew Bible, um, I have found that so much of the work has been done in Hebrew. It's not as easily accessible to those who don't speak Hebrew or read Hebrew. And so, what you've managed to do is kind of bring out a lot of these sources and source material into the conversation for an audience, particularly a Latter day Saint audience, but an audience that nonetheless would have a very difficult time uh, getting into some of the source material with regards to ancient Near Eastern and Jewish literature.
Yeah. So one of the big, big treasures in scholarship that's not as appreciated as it should be is Israeli scholarship from the past 100 years or so. And there's quite a lot being done in many fields. One of the papers I drew on had, well, it's controversial in some of the ways that it reconstructs ritual. It does do a fantastic job of mining the literary sources, and that Josiah Beitner is about how it is Jacob in one of the synagogue mosaics. And we'll talk about that in a moment. But there's just so much available there. And because I am able to access it, I want to make sure that, like you said, it's part of the conversation. We know what's out there, it gives us new ways to think about things. We don't have to reinvent the wheel and everything either.
Yeah, and as someone who's kind of new to this world, this area of research, I appreciate a lot of the work that you've done, as well as a number of other scholars as well who have kind of brought some of these um, topics to the forefront for an English audience. Um, I do want to get into your paper, and I would love to talk about the mosaics and a number of things related to your paper. But I do briefly want to get your take on something, just because you had mentioned that here in the future you'll be working on something related to both the Jasher with
Yeah,
Spencer Krause. And you also mentioned something about Josiah's reforms.
yeah,
This has been a very hot topic, particularly in Latter day Saint like podcasting and YouTube circles. And I have also sort of dove into this a little bit here on the channel as well. There's a lot of discussion around Josiah's reforms within some of these circles in the church, and certainly with uh, biblical scholars as well. And I'm curious, where do you fall on, and I know we've kind of
uh-huh.
talked about it before, but where do you fall in trying to understand Josiah's reforms from the perspective that is portrayed in the biblical texts, as well as maybe some extra biblical source material that may suggest there's a lot more nuance here to Josiah, his story, his reforms, and what we typically refer to or hear in these kind of conversations as the quote unquote, Deuteronomists and the Deuteronomistic history.
Yeah, so it's a big topic. Now, a lot of it is not very well based on the sources, and there's a lot of just assumptions and presuppositions that don't really match what's in the text either. I basically fall on the side of it being a needed reform to uproot idolatry. It had a political context, and that was the weakening of the Assyrian Empire and Judah's desire to become independent. Now, the king does have a duty to make sure that the cultus, the temple, priesthood, everything functions properly. And I'll be looking at the relationship of the book in the narrative to the reforms. But the spoiler is they're not dependent on a book. They're the same kind of reforms that you do when you want to uproot idolatry. They're not about changing beliefs, really. And when we look at apocryphal literature, and I'm using the term broadly, the sources that do mention Josiah are 100% overwhelmingly positive. And when they do admit that there were mistakes and errors, what they basically are saying is that Josiah was too trusting that the people had actually repented. So there will be a lot of the apocryphal sources included there to take a look, just to see more of a reception history of Josiah's reforms. But there's not a lot of support for the reforms being nefarious or meant to get rid of Heavenly Mother or other legitimate beliefs. It really is a matter of removing idolatry.
Yeah, and this does seem to be kind of the main crux of the conversation currently is whether or not Josiah and his reforms were nefarious in some way, shape, or form. I know Neil Rapley wrote a paper on this a few years ago, um, and he takes a little bit more of a nuanced approach to it. He doesn't fall too far on one side of the discussion or the other. And I did a video on that paper
Yeah,
particularly.
you're
And
talking about his family dynamics paper.
yes, yes.
Yeah, that's fantastic, and I do recommend it in the paper. It's just we can go a little bit beyond it. The paper is great for showing how it would have played out in his family, but there's a lot more we can say about the reforms from a larger perspective.
Yeah, and I really appreciated that paper when I read it, because it provided some further context to the difference of opinion presented to us in the Book of Mormon between Lehi and Nephi and Laman and Lemuel. There's a sort of tension here, and I appreciated that in the paper because we're talking about Lehi's family dynamics as it relates to the time period in which Josiah's reforms are beginning to shape and take place and be enforced. And you sort of get a better feel for Laman and Lemuel and
Yeah,
their maybe their perspective and where they're coming from and why it is that they're so at odds with certain decisions made by Lehi and Nephi throughout the first two books of the Book of Mormon. So I really appreciated that paper, and I felt it was very balanced and
Neil
nuanced.
always writes fantastic stuff.
Yeah, I think I'll include that paper in the description below too for anybody who wants to read it. But I did also do a video on that maybe 2 years ago now, I think,
Okay.
for anybody who wants to watch that video as well. I basically just kind of go through the paper and I don't have too much to add to it other than personal opinion. But it is a really well done paper, and given that this is such a hotly discussed topic at the moment, I felt it relevant to at least mention.
Yeah, and just a final word on that. Basically, what I'm doing in the paper is presenting a strong case for why we don't need to be uncritical, but we can still accept the reforms for what they were meant to be. Maybe there's a few excesses with them, but overall they were good and they were needed. And I'll be laying out a case for that.
Yeah. And so it may be at times that um, the reforms themselves, what they were aiming to do, was appropriate and even necessary,
Yeah,
and maybe the way that we look at the reforms here in the 21st century, um, maybe sometimes we get a little too ahead of ourselves of what we can say about them
yeah,
with the current landscape of information we have. Um, and also, I think maybe at times, even as we look at the biblical text regarding Josiah and what it seems like he was trying to accomplish, um, maybe there are areas in which things were taken a little too far. There's maybe a little bit of an overcorrection in one way, shape, or form. Um, but I'm willing to give benefit of the doubt, um, and I'm looking forward to your work on that as well,
awesome. Thank
because
you.
I know that you've been kind of um, I don't know if hounded is the right word, but I know that you get brought into this, dragged into this conversation quite often. So it will be fun and interesting and enlightening when we finally get to see some more of that kind of written out and some of those sources brought to the forefront a little bit.
Yeah, I appreciate that. So yeah, let's look a bit more into some of the cool things about deification and planets.
Yes, let's. So in the ancient world, and I don't know if we want to differentiate between time periods, whether we're talking about Bronze Age or Iron
Mm,
Age, or if we want to talk about differences between First Temple period and Second Temple period Israelite culture and history. But broadly speaking, when we peek back into the ancient world, the ancient Near East, we tend to see some really interesting things, at least interesting to me, regarding uh, maybe the role that the sun and the stars and planets had in the lives of these ancient peoples, and maybe we can speak broadly and then talk about Israelites more specifically. But what role exactly did the stars, the planets, the cosmos have in sort of the cultural and religious life of these ancient peoples?
yeah, absolutely. So we can take a broad look at this without getting bogged down in the specific details. But basically, from any time we have a record, be it rock art several thousand years ago to some written records, First and Second Temple periods, the sun is either a god or it's a lower god. It's either a main god or it's a lower god in the pantheon. The sun, without it, crops don't grow. You don't have the things you need. You're freezing to death. And you don't know what time of day it is. Time was exceptionally important, especially to ancient Israelites and Jews, because your religious observances depended on it. I mean, same's true to an extent in Mesopotamia and Egypt. But if we focus just on Israel and Judaism later, time is how you fulfill your duty to God. You've got prayers you got to say, holidays you've got to keep. So you have to know what day it is, what time of year. The moon signals when the month begins. There's a lot of ritual that goes into making sure you know when that month properly begins. And there's some interesting things about calendars at Qumran and Book of Enoch, for example. They knew that the year could get wildly out of hand. Because if you don't have a leap year or do something with the calendar, then you get that kind of calendar creep, and your holidays get further and further away from the day they're supposed to be. So at Qumran, they said this, I mean, in the Book of Enoch, I should be specific. In the Book of Enoch, they said this is angelic rebellion. Angels were not doing what God told them to do in controlling the times and seasons. So they were punished for that. But the sun brought you blessings and everything you need. So if it wasn't God directly, it was how God interacted with you and brought his blessings to the world. Or if he were angry with you, he could bring about droughts and famines and so on through the sun, the moon, and the stars. The stars controlled an individual's fate, a nation's fate. They told you what time was fortunate, what time would bring disaster. This is the roots of astrology. That's what it all boils down to. But in many ways, it was considered a legitimate religious practice.
So we see a lot of this taking place not only in the ancient Near East, but in the Mediterranean with the Romans and Greeks, and a whole host of other civilizations throughout the world. This is not a, a practice that is entirely unique to uh, the ancient Near East or the Levant, um,
Yeah.
broadly speaking. And so I think I had recently spoken to Dr. Matthew Bowen on the channel this last week,
Oh, nice.
and we talked about the concept of sacred space. And something he said I found very relevant and important is that the ancient Israelites did not exist in a vacuum.
Right.
And I would say no culture really exists entirely in a vacuum. And so we have a lot of overlap, it seems like, in the ancient world between various cultures uh, with regard to studying what we now kind of call astrology or the study um, and a belief that these stars, the planets and stars and the sun have sort of relevance and symbolic or literal meaning in how we live our lives. Um, with that kind of mindset, um, you also mentioned the sun itself was either seen as either a head god out of a pantheon or maybe a lesser god, depending upon the context or the culture.
Right.
Um, so, with that in mind, how how did the ancient Israelites sort of conceive of uh, deity, the concept of deity? What were gods? What were angels? What were these sort of divine figures? What did it mean for them to be a god, and why was it relevant or meaningful that they be represented either literally or symbolically as synonymous with the stars and the planets and so forth?
So that's a very big question. So one thing that's interesting is that there's not any kind of ontological divides between gods with uppercase G, as is often said in English, lowercase, angels, demons, all that. These were all beings that were, well, they had a lot of power. They were in some sense immortal, though it doesn't mean they couldn't die. But if we look specifically in ancient Israel, there's the idea there's God, the head God, the Father, there's a creator, there's his son or sons, and then there's everyone that's in his court. We have all these beings that are in his court, and he is in charge of them. He assigns them portions, just in Deuteronomy 32. They're all supposed to make sure that the world functions, is harmonious. They prevent chaos from coming back and making the world null and without void, as in Genesis 1:2. So, yeah, in Genesis 1:2. So they have a really important job. making sure the world runs correctly. The rain comes in its season, the sun doesn't burn the crops, the seasons are counted correctly. And on top of that, they're supposed to make sure that the world also functions ethically and morally. And when they cause the nations under them or tolerate their violations, then they get deposed from their position. And that's going to be the basis of a lot of the traditions that led to fuller understanding of who Satan and the devil is in later Judaism and Christianity. But it comes down to this idea of the gods not fulfilling the function they were given as part of the divine council. If you're a god of Moab, you're supposed to make sure that the Moabites don't engage in horrible violations, such as murdering each other, committing incest, idolatry, all sorts of things like that. But if you don't, you're deposed. That's where we have Psalm 82 and other things. For
Yeah, I was
ancient
gonna
is yeah. Sorry,
yeah,
go
I
ahead.
was gonna ask about Psalm 82. It seems to be at least the direction that I see Psalm 82 being taken in some of the literature is that this is maybe happening um, sort of during either the Babylonian captivity or maybe shortly after when this is written. I don't know if that's true or not. But
No one knows exactly when it's written, and all the evidence that we actually have for it is insufficient to come to decision. There's also no reason why it would have to be exilic or post-exilic.
yeah, I this is the kind of go-to psalm for a lot of rhetorical purposes when it comes to talking about the divine council in the Hebrew Bible. But this is for purposes of this discussion that this is the psalm that we see um, expressly portrayed the sort of demoting of the gods, so to speak. We have being the deposition of the gods in the council, and so this is something that was I don't know if we would say it's regularly seen throughout ancient literature, but this idea that gods can be deposed if they don't sort of hold up their responsibilities
Right.
seems to be a somewhat common idea at this time.
Yeah, I mean, in most ways, what goes on in the heavens mirrors what goes down in the earth, in the king and his court. So just as the king isn't required to keep on the people that violate his orders if he's strong, same with God. He's not going to keep on the gods that don't further his purposes. And this is often expressed later on in astronomical, astrological terms. There's no neat divide between astrology and astronomy in the ancient world. Now, with Enoch and the fallen angels, this is kind of the background to it. They're conceptualized as angels in that later Judaism, though if we're talking First Temple period, they would have been seen as gods.
So we don't see, as you've already mentioned, we don't see a strong ontological distinction made between the gods and even between the gods and what we call angels, especially in the Hebrew Bible. But I would make the argument we probably don't see much of a distinction even in the New Testament either. Um,
It's not as strong as we might think if we believe that early Judaism, Christianity were very monotheistic.
yeah, and the most of the pushback I get on my channel when I talk about anything related to the Divine Council is typically from Protestant evangelicals who want to hold to a very stark, very um, distinct monotheism in the Hebrew scriptures and in Israelite culture compared to their neighbors being these, dirty heathens who are polytheistic and idolatrous and so forth. Um, and so there seems to be a, as you said, a sort of a need to preserve the idea that these ancient peoples that produced the scriptures were entirely monotheistic.
Yeah.
And so there has to be some distinction between the God that we know as the God of the universe, who we call Heavenly Father, um, the Tetragrammaton, even,
Right.
as opposed to other gods of the various nations or even angels. Um, when do we start to see a distinction in? I wouldn't even say ontology necessarily, but where do we start to see a distinction in maybe class or role between gods and angels?
Well, you start to see a distinction in the late Second Temple period with the Septuagint, other translations, but it's not very strong. And as Paula Fredrickson said once memorably, every ancient monotheist was a polytheist. There is to go back to what you're saying about how do you draw a line between God and the rest. There is a distinction that we look into a bit in the paper, but in basically the main distinction between what was considered acceptable and wasn't is, was God separated by the degree of his power and his majesty, and was he sovereign over all? And in case if we're talking about the sun and the moon, there's an old myth that the sun and the moon were created in an identical size. And they were complaining about that. They said, how will two kings serve with one crown? People will see us and they'll think that the gods are equal. God said, you're right, moon, make yourself smaller. So the distinction is drawn in astronomical terms. The moon is smaller and weaker and derives its light from the sun, so it means it's ranked below the sun. The sun is ranked below God because it takes its orders from God. Some of the early understandings of Jesus have him still ranking himself below God the Father. He wasn't necessarily believed to be, exactly equal. He was a little bit below him than some of the earliest Christian beliefs. That's how you preserved your monotheism, even if you had other gods that were legitimate and active and powerful and created the world or helped run it. There's still a distinction because God is ranked above them. And that really fits in with what we believe about gods. When we become gods, we don't become equal to God in all his abilities and his wisdom and his power. He's always going to be greater.
Yeah, I this is a kind of ongoing discussion as well amongst Latter-day Saints of exactly what does exaltation look like. There's been various leaders of the church over the history of the church who have sort of posited different ideas about what that looks like. But I really want to highlight something that you said, and that is that when we look at the Latter day Saint conception of exaltation, or what we might call theosis or deification, though those terms also have specific meaning in other
Right.
religious culture as
We
well.
use them loosey goosey in the church.
Yeah, we do. I use them fairly loosey goosey on the channel as well. But what I mean is, of course, the LDS conception of exaltation or eternal progression. Um, in none of the different ideas or models put forth by Joseph Smith or Brigham Young or anyone else do we ever see the idea that we will become in our exalted state as great as the Father or
Yeah.
surpassing him.
We never
None
depose
of
them.
that comes into view, that those are aptly rejected, I think, by pretty much everybody who's really put forth any effort on the issue.
I've never seen a statement to the contrary, and one really helpful illustration, I mean, regardless of the exact details, it's Orson Hyde's kind of diagram. It has the crown above, which represents God, and then it splits into all sorts of people below it and underneath, and but it's always God ranked above. It
Yeah.
just, and if you look at the way they would have seen this in the first temple, that increases God's majesty, because just like a king or an emperor is more powerful the more vassal kings he has under him, same with God. When we increase in power and majesty, so does he.
Yeah, no, that's a really helpful sort of visual. Um, the way that I've always understood it, as we continue to grow and learn and receive knowledge and glory, uh, we then in turn praise God, who gave us these things and provided the means by which we can grow. And so all glory is added to God.
Yeah, and that's why people weren't shy to ascribe to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob verses in the Bible in terms that refer to God. So there's a lot of fun stuff that we explored in that.
Yeah, and we see that even at times. The Psalms will even refer to David or the Davidic king uh, as being kind of in that same boat, receiving some form of glory and worship, not necessarily on par with the glory and worship received by God, but sort of in line with it. And that, as you know, we even as Solomon at the dedication of the temple was worshipped alongside God, it was understood that God is first and foremost in that order. Um, so with all that kind of laying the groundwork for this discussion, let's dive into your paper. There's a lot of really cool things in here. I'm looking forward to it officially coming out here towards the end of the year. Um, I'm looking forward to the conversations around these papers that are going to be published at that time. Um, so again, to reiterate, the title of the paper is called "My Name is the Sun, Patriarchs, Planets, and the Book of Abraham." And you start the paper um, kind of giving an overview. We have a short discussion about what the paper is going to be about, but you start the meat of the paper with Kolob.
Yeah.
And this is a very interesting topic for a number of reasons, both because I think Latter-day Saints who are maybe a little bit more knowledgeable or apt to study the Book of Abraham and its various uh, aspects, whether that's the actual text itself or whether that's the process of translation, what have you. Um, the Book of Abraham serves in some sense as a litmus test, I think,
Hmm.
for where people fall in how they view scripture in the church.
Yeah.
Um,
There's some truth to that.
and I don't want to put too fine a point on it. I don't want to overstate that, certainly. Um, but because the Book of Abraham is so hotly discussed as being sort of the smoking gun of anti Latter day Saint apologetics, the Book of Abraham serves a very specific role um, for those looking to sort of discredit not just the Book of Abraham itself, but to discredit Joseph Smith's prophetic mantle and ability, um, and all of the doctrines and principles that are found in the content of the Book of Abraham. Um, so to not belabor the point, the Book of Abraham does serve a very important function in how we talk about the church and uh, uh, how we talk about Joseph Smith as a prophet and what
Yeah.
scripture is in the church. Kolob itself, to bring this kind of full circle here, Kolob itself is one of those specific points that is brought up the most. It is incredibly fascinating, all on its own. I know that a lot of Latter Day Saint scholars who have discussed the Book of Abraham uh, come back to talking about Kolob in some way, shape, or form. It's addressed quite often, um, and critics like to sort of point at it as something to mock, to laugh at. It serves a rhetorical point
Yeah.
for those seeking validation from an anti Latter Day Saint perspective. Um, could you maybe briefly talk about what are some of the general ideas that have been put forth of what Kolob is or who Kolob is? There's a few different sort of ideas of what that might be, and then maybe kind of talk about where you and Spencer fall in your paper.
Sure. I mean, there's a lot of ideas, like you said, out there. We have things like the Kolob theorem, which weaves a whole bunch of, well, a bit dodgy science around a few verses in the Book of Abraham. And I don't think you can go really far in exploring modern astronomy based on Book of Abraham. It's not going to take you very far because that's never what it was meant to do. So we don't really look at any of the scientific things about it because that's not really what the Book of Abraham cares about or what the ancient sources paralleling it care about either. I mean, yeah, these things would have been interesting to the ancients, but it wasn't the purpose of this kind of writings. If we're dealing with purely astronomical treatises, then yeah, but that's not what the Book of Abraham is. I mean, the other thing that we don't fall, I mean, sorry, a bit tongue tied. What I'm trying to say is that Spencer and I also consider this a legitimately ancient concept. It's not something that really maps well onto 19th century books like Thomas Dick's Future State. That's been one of the sources since Von Brody pointed to it that critics have liked to claim is behind the Book of Abraham. They're very, very different things. Now, several LDS scholars have proposed that Kolob is a symbol of Jesus Christ. And that's where we fall on this. We think that's actually a very good suggestion because it makes sense of the material in the book and it finds more than ample support in ancient texts. And that's kind of where we come to Jacob as being the most important figure in all the texts that we've looked at. More so than Abraham, even.
Yeah, I found that quite interesting. When you take a survey of the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament, particularly, a lot of focus is on Abraham. And so Jacob is certainly one of the uh, premier patriarchs in our history. But oftentimes it's Abraham that is the one who's sort of the father of many nations, so to speak. He's the father
Yeah.
of Judaism, Christianity, so forth. And so that was an interesting point that Jacob does seem to be brought up quite a bit more in this area here. Um, so with that in mind, where do Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob sort of fall uh, in terms of their relation to God, the covenant that was made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? Where do they fall in terms of their relationship to the sun, the planets, and the stars? Um, maybe we could kind of start there, and then And
Yeah.
then we can discuss maybe why Jacob seems to be kind of at the forefront.
Yeah. So, I mean, they all are associated with the stars. Isaac, a little bit less than the rest. He does often get short shrift in that. Although there's an interesting new book that's just come out. I haven't had a chance to buy it or read it yet. It's in Hebrew about reappraising Isaac's role in the Bible, which is aiming to show how he has a much greater role than is formally appreciated. So I think that'll be interesting. But for now, Abraham is the astronomer with a capital A in the ancient Jewish and Christian imagination. And he is the one that leaves it behind in many of these traditions to pursue a higher calling of following God. He's the first one to whom the covenant is given. He's the father of nations, the father of the faithful, to borrow the Muslim phrase. And Abraham's covenant is seen as him becoming God and becoming the instrument through which God provides his blessings and bounty in the world. So in one text, the Sefer Yetzirah, or the book of creation or formation, Abraham is like the seven planets, like the sun, the moon, and the stars. Once he enters into that covenant, he is the person mediating between God and the world. And then he's also, because of wordplay in the Bible, several verses like the shield of Abraham in the Psalms were used to mean Abraham himself. In the Psalms, it means that God is like a shield to Abraham. The referent is God. But in some of the later Jewish traditions, it's understood that Abraham himself has become a god. And that's in our paper. In fact, let me pull that up here. So yeah, for the Lord God is a sun and a shield. The Lord giveth grace and glory, no good thing will he withhold from those who walk uprightly. Here scripture speaks of our father Abraham, who is upright or righteous. The word son stands for Abraham, as it is said, who raised up the righteous man from the east, which is where the sun rises. So if you interpret the righteous man as referring to Abraham, and you're reading a bit deeper below the surface, the east is associated with the rising sun. So that then gets connected to Abraham. And we also see that they take a verse about the children of Het, answered Abraham, saying unto him, Hear us, my Lord, thou art a prince of God among us. And that was taken to mean that Abraham was a divine representative of God on earth, and thus a god. So he fulfills that role as a god there. They take a lot of verses that signify God and apply it to Abraham. And another one, they also take Abraham to be a god because if he's like the first day of creation or the sun in the east, he represents light, and he represents not just the regular light we have, but the light of creation, the divine light that came forth from God before there was the sun or anything else. And in fact, in Doctrine and Covenants, we kind of have a similar idea. The section eludes me at the moment, but we have Christ being the light of the world and bringing forth everything into creation. So that idea is even found in the Doctrine and Covenants to a degree. And then just with Abraham, I want to pull up something here. So yeah, his whole interest in the stars, which you can read Stephen Smoot's paper, watch his video, will give you a lot of the ancient background to that.
Yeah, quite good.
Yeah, that became associated with him leaving just the secular use of that and actually becoming that kind of instrument for God. And then I think that that's really kind of the drift of where the traditions about Abraham are. He's given a stone carved from the sun. That's how he heals people. And that connects to ancient medicine and beliefs and practices. So he heals people. When he dies, he then is connected to the sun because that stone is placed on the wheel of the sun as it spins. So now, in a sense, Abraham is the sun. When you see the sun shine, you feel its warmth. That's Abraham, the being that's running it. With
Yeah, that's
Isaac, yeah, the references are a bit more diffuse, but his sacrifice is depicted in a lot of the synagogue art. And those are really interesting.
yeah, it is for as little as Isaac seems to be brought up explicitly in the text. Uh, Isaac's sacrifice is sort of a central. Um, I don't know quite what the word is, but it's a central point that is brought forward again and again throughout the Hebrew Bible and into the New Testament as well. Certainly, Christians would much later Christians would sort of adopt a lot of the imagery and uh, idea of Isaac's sacrifice as being a sort of a type of Christ.
Yeah,
We see that quite a bit, even in the Book of Mormon as well. Um, and so it is interesting that for as little as he's explicitly mentioned, that pivotal moment in the Hebrew scriptures does come to the forefront of a lot of thought and ideas put forward in the scriptures.
there's a medieval Hebrew poem that's recited by the Middle Eastern Jewish communities for New Year's and Yom Kippur, Day of Atonement, and it's called When the Gates of Heaven Opened. And it's about asking God to recognize what Abraham and Isaac did and help forgive people of their descendants their sins. And it has this refrain that goes, the binder, the bound, and the altar. So that's the refrain that appears at the end of each house, and it's just to remind God of this covenant. Now, at one point in this poem, Isaac is called the third of the heavenly lights, the one third of the heavenly lights, the other two being in Abraham and Jacob. So the idea is never far from the surface that Isaac is part of the three big fathers, and they connect as sun, moon, and stars, and in different degrees, but they're all connected somehow to that. And in ancient synagogue art, we have a motif that appears in several synagogues in the Byzantine era, where you have the zodiac and the sun or Helios figure in the middle. That's the middle panel. You have all the signs of the zodiac, and you have a chariot with horses and with the figure that's either an anthropomorphic figure, or in one case the sun itself only, without an anthropomorphic figure riding in it. So that's the Helios panel. Above that you have a temple, and it's got a lot of cosmic imagery there, like different lions and beasts guarding it. You've got a veil that opens to the doors. You have different symbols for it. And below, you have a panel with the sacrifice of Isaac, or the binding of Isaac below that. And we don't want to approach the art of the ancient world as too rigidly functional. I mean, these had, in the ancient conception, any kind of jewelry or poem or decoration or art had many, many meanings and purposes. And part of your education was being able to show different facets of the same thing, like holding up a finely cut diamond in the light and seeing how it refracts and reflects differently. So we cannot approach it as just meaning one thing and one thing only. It would change depending on your level of education, the time of the year, how well you want to connect it to other things, so many different factors. But one possible interpretation is that the sacrifice is connected to the heavenly temple, and that is connected to the figures of the zodiac and the sun. And in some cases, it is justifiable to come up with an interpretation that the figure of the sun is one of the patriarchs. We'll come back to that with Jacob. But that is one possible meaning. It's one we can hold if we don't insist that this is the meaning. Some of the classic work on this that shaped several generations of scholars was Erwin Goodenough's Jewish Symbols. The problem with that is that it's too programmatic. It's too much trying to force just one reading and one only. So if we hold a bit of a looser thing, we can actually get more use out of these images in understanding the religious world of ancient Judaism.
Yeah, that could be a difficult sticking point, I think, for a lot of people in the 21st century. When we look back on history, especially it seems the further back we go, the more I think the more play in the joints we see, a little
Yeah,
more nuance in how we understand some of these things, and for a 21st century mind or audience, we really like things to be black and white. It's one or the other. It's this or that. And so coming to terms with the fact that a single piece of art, a mosaic of some sort or something else, may have actually served many different both rhetorical purposes and artistic functions.
yeah, just art sometimes.
That could be a little bit difficult, I think, for us to wrap our head around. Um, and I think part of that may come from, and I don't know if you have some thoughts on this as well, but I think sometimes we're very afraid in the modern era of engaging in presentism, and we're also afraid of parallelomania, drawing too many conclusions and drawing too many parallels between things too rigidly.
Yeah,
And um, that can be difficult to navigate, I think. And myself and a lot of other Latter-day Saint content creators, we love when some text from some place somewhere says something that really seems to align with something we believe. Um, and this is something else that Dr. Bowen had brought up in our discussion as well. Hugh Nibley was a major figure in sort of kicking down the doors to Latter-day Saints having access to some of the scholarship of first century Christianity
right.
and Second Temple Judaism and so forth. And often today, some of Hugh Nibley's writings get sort of not necessarily attacked and whatnot, but certainly gets kind of put aside as being maybe too engaged in parallelomania and so forth. And so, because of that, I think we can be quite cautious in
Yeah,
scholarship, and then lay members like myself, who are not professionals in these fields, um, we may not always have that same caution. I know I certainly haven't in the past. And so we like to attach ourselves to things that seem to agree with us, even though in context, maybe it doesn't so much, or maybe it could have multiple uh,
There's different ways to think about some things also.
Yeah.
Yeah, so Nibley, I mean, he really did bring in a lot of important scholarship for the time. A lot of this scholarship was in its infancy, and there was a lot of debate among art historians and others about how these things fit together. So you can't really blame Nibley much for that. I'm sure if he were doing the bulk of his scholarship in the late 20th century, early 21st century, to have a different view. But I mean, he was doing much of it in the 20s and 30s. So you've always got to remember that with Nibley and cut him a bit of slack that way. Now, it doesn't mean that we shouldn't bear the newer scholarship in mind and consider it, but yeah, that's Nibley did amazing things and he opened the door for us, but you also need to understand how scholarship has changed. There's a fantastic book that I really recommend, and in fact, anything written by Stephen Fine, but it's called Art and Judaism in the Greco-Roman World. Stephen Fine goes through all these kind of issues with the art, what we can know about it, how earlier scholarship kind of settled on what they did. He brings some voices into the conversation that have often been forgotten. And it's just really, really good corrective and a way to think of things. So I recommend his books highly. I've used them a bit, in fact, in this paper. They should be there in the notes. To go back a bit to the art and what we can learn from it. So
Yeah.
there's a
Before I
phrase,
derailed us.
yeah. Oh yeah, no problem at all. I want to make sure just that we kind of touch on some of these things before I forget, because I'm very forgetful. So one way to conceptualize the synagogue art that we're looking at is that the representations of the zodiac and the sun, they are the dome of heaven. And this was a phrase that was coined by an archaeologist, Carl Lehmann, back in 1945. And he was looking at early Christian art and architecture, and he was trying to find how it connected to the Greek and Roman stuff. Christian art history has basically moved on from his thesis quite a bit. There were a lot of flaws in how he used the evidence and things. But this phrase is very, very apt because it means that when they had mention of the stars and the zodiac, whether in the hymns that they were singing or the art that they were reproducing in the synagogues, it connected them to the realm of heaven. It brought them upwards and it brought heaven downwards to them and connected them. Kind of like what we do when we go into the temple and we're connecting our world with God's world. And that's what these things serve to do. And when you connect that to the sacrifice of Isaac, at least some of the people would have seen that as a supreme act of faith that brought us closer to God. And when you connect that to the temple, it allows us to become clean before God and to stand face to face with him. The other thing that would have happened is because anciently it was believed that a big function of the angels was to sing the liturgy of heaven. They would sing hymns and praises and prayers to God. And when you did that on earth, you were joining in with the angels. And that's actually not very different from what we do in the temples either. And as you all know, there's cases where we ask angels of witnesses and so on. It's a very similar idea to what we do. So even though it doesn't have to be identical, it can enrich our understanding of our own practices too.
Yeah. On that note, Hugh Nibley had a paper called, I believe, it's called Early Christian Prayer Circles,
Yeah,
which is fantastic. It's one of
it
my
is.
favorite things that he's written. And it talks more about some Christian practices um, that would a Latter-day Saint would easily recognize as being akin to the prayer circle and things that may go on in our own Latter-day Saint temples. And what that is one of the points that is made by some of these early Christian sources is that as these Christians were engaged in these sort of ritual prayers, they were counted amongst the angels in the council of heaven, singing these prayers to heaven and so forth. And there's a number of really cool and interesting things in that paper related to that idea.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned it. It really is a fantastic one, which coincidentally was also, I think, one of the first things of scholarship Margaret Barker read.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I think that's what she credited as actually bringing interest into that. Now, it has also been quoted, in fact, in some studies of Jewish mysticism back in the 50s and 60s by Isaiah Tishbe. So it made some waves back in the day.
Yeah, that's interesting.
So yeah, this liturgy is extremely important in the forms of Jewish mysticism called the Hechalot and Merkava literature, which is literature of the heavenly palaces and the chariots. Basically, people have all sorts of incantations and prayers that they use in order to ascend to the heavenly realm. They have to pass all the angels, so they have names of power that they have to use to overcome some of the angels that are there as gatekeepers to prevent people from entering them worthily. And you ascend to gaze upon God and sing his praises along with the angels. And something that we touched upon in our paper is that there is a body of literature which are hymns and prayers sung in Aramaic, the everyday language of ancient Jews, which were written for a popular audience. And several of them include heavenly and cosmic scenes. And you do kind of get that feeling of the whole congregation joining in with the angels. And for Jacob, he is the mediating being par excellence in Jewish sources. You find him mentioned more oftenly, more explicitly than any of the others.
Yeah,
And we can,
that is quite
yeah,
interesting. Um, so you in your paper, there's a large and hefty section dedicated all to Jacob. Um, so let's get into this. There's some really cool things here.
yeah. And before we do, this kind of belief about Jacob also contributed to early Christian understandings of Jesus. It was part of the conceptual background that allowed them to formulate early theology and understand who he was in relation to them and to God. We only touch on that briefly in the paper because it's a bit outside the scope, but it's a subject well worth looking into more.